The senior officer exhaled and turned to Marcus. "Come with me." They walked back inside, past the mess left behind by the raid. The small rusted gun still sat on the table, the old photographs and documents scattered around it. Marcus stared at the picture of his father and the unknown man. There had to be a connection, something buried in the past that had finally come crashing into the present. The officer sat down across from him. "We ran the serial number on that gun," he said. "It was used in a homicide nearly 40 years ago." Marcus felt his stomach drop. The officer continued. "The victim was a man named Richard Cole. He was an accountant involved in a fraud investigation back in the 80s. The case went cold when the primary suspect disappeared." Marcus frowned. "And you think my father—" The officer held up a hand. "Your father wasn't the suspect." He slid a faded newspaper clipping across the table. The headline read, **** local man vanishes amid fraud scandal. Police searching for business partner ****. Marcus's eyes widened as he saw the grainy black and white photo beneath the text. It was the same man standing next to his father in the old photograph. The officer pointed to the caption. "That's William Lawson." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. "Mr. Lawson." The officer nodded. "Your father wasn't covering up a crime. He was trying to protect Lawson from whoever was after him." He leaned in, and it looks like Lawson's been running ever since. Marcus tried to process it all. His father had been protecting a fugitive. But why? And if Mr. Lawson had been in hiding all these years, why come back now? Then something clicked. The anonymous tip. The hidden box. The sudden police raid. This was planned, Marcus said under his breath. He looked up at the officer. Someone wanted the police to find this. The officer nodded. And they wanted Lawson to come out of hiding. Marcus swallowed hard. The real question was who? Before he could ask, the officer's radio crackled. "We've got a problem." The voice on the other end was tense. "The suspect, Lawson, he's gone." Marcus shot up from his chair. "What do you mean, gone?" "He escaped. The transport van was intercepted. Someone took him." Marcus's heart pounded. This wasn't just about an old crime. Someone was still pulling the strings. And whoever it was, they weren't finished yet. Marcus felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. Mr. Lawson was gone. The only person who could have answered his questions had vanished again. But this time, someone had taken him. The officers scrambled, voices overlapping, as they tried to figure out what had happened. The police radio crackled with updates. Witnesses claimed they saw a black SUV speeding away just moments after the van was attacked. No license plates, no clear description of the driver. Marcus's thoughts raced. This wasn't just about the past anymore. Someone was making sure the truth stayed buried, and they were willing to go to extreme lengths to do it. The senior officer rubbed his temple, looking exhausted. "This isn't over," he muttered. "Whoever's behind this has been planning for a long time." Marcus looked back at the table, at the old photographs and documents that had sparked this entire nightmare. He picked up the picture of his father and Mr. Lawson, staring at it like it might somehow give him answers. His father had tried to protect Mr. Lawson. But from what? Or from who? Then a thought hit him. The anonymous tip. Someone had waited years to reveal what was hidden in this house. Why now? Why not before? Marcus's father had passed years ago, and Mr. Lawson had been in hiding all this time. But now suddenly, everything was being exposed. What if the person who tipped off the police wasn't trying to help? What if they were trying to flush Mr. Lawson out? Marcus felt a chill crawl up his spine. Someone had wanted him to be found. And now, just as quickly, they had taken him. The officer sighed. "We'll put out an alert for the vehicle, but if they don't want to be found, this could take time." Marcus nodded slowly, but deep down, he knew whoever was behind this wasn't going to wait. This wasn't just about an old crime. It was about something bigger, something that had remained in the shadows for decades. Before he could piece it together, another officer walked in, holding something wrapped in an old cloth. He placed it carefully on the table before unwrapping it. Marcus's stomach twisted as he saw what lay inside. A small rusted handgun. The room went still. The senior officer exhaled sharply. "Well, that changes things." Marcus shook his head instantly. "That's not mine. I've never seen that before in my life." The officer wasn't convinced. It was hidden in the same spot as the box. Someone put it there for a reason. Marcus's mind raced. His father had never owned a gun, at least not that he had ever seen. But the look on the officers' faces told him this wasn't just any old weapon. It meant something. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every second that passed felt heavier, the weight of the unknown pressing down on Marcus. Then another voice, this time from outside. A shout. A commotion. One of the officers rushed to the window, his hand going to his radio. "We've got movement outside," he said, his tone urgent. Marcus's pulse pounded. Was this it? Was the person who started all of this finally making a move? The senior officer's radio crackled. "We've got someone trying to leave the scene. Male, mid-50s. Looks nervous." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Mid-50s? That wasn't just some stranger. That could be. Before he could say another word, the officer nearest to the door turned and bolted outside. The air outside buzzed with energy, the sound of footsteps pounding against the pavement. Marcus stood frozen, his entire world unraveling around him. Whoever this person was, they held the answers he so desperately needed. And they were trying to get away. Marcus barely had time to process what was happening before the officers sprinted toward the fleeing man. The crowd outside shifted, people turning their heads, trying to get a glimpse of the unfolding chaos. Shouts rang through the air, the sharp commands of officers cutting through the murmurs of onlookers. Marcus stepped toward the doorway, straining to see past the flashing lights. His mind raced. Who was this man? Why was he running? And more importantly, what did he know? Then for just a moment, the crowd parted. And Marcus saw him. The man was hunched over, his movements frantic. His gray-streaked hair was damp with sweat, his eyes darting wildly as he pushed past stunned bystanders. But it wasn't just his face that caught Marcus's attention. It was the way he moved. The way his shoulders curled inward, like someone carrying a weight they couldn't bear. Marcus had seen that posture before. His chest tightened. He knew this man. Before he could call out, two officers tackled the man to the ground. A struggle ensued, gravel crunching, voices overlapping. The man let out a grunt of protest, but he didn't fight back. It was as if he had expected this moment. As if he had been running, not just from the police, but from something much deeper. Then one of the officers yanked him up, pushing him toward the police car. And that's when the man finally lifted his head. His eyes locked onto Marcus's. Time seemed to stop. Marcus felt like the ground had vanished beneath him. His mind reeled, his throat tightening. Because the man standing there, the one caught, the one who had tried to escape, was someone Marcus had never expected to see again. Mr. Lawson. The name hit him like a thunderclap. Mr. Lawson had been his father's best friend. A man who had been like an uncle to Marcus growing up. A man who had vanished from his life years ago without a single explanation. And now here he was, caught in the middle of this storm, tangled up in a secret Marcus never even knew existed. Before Marcus could move, the officers were already pushing Mr. Lawson into the back of the police car. But just before the door shut, Mr. Lawson's voice cut through the noise, hoarse and desperate. "Marcus, listen to me. They don't know the whole truth." His eyes were wild, pleading. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. Your father, he tried to stop it." Marcus's stomach turned. "Stop what?" he shouted. But the door slammed shut before he could get an answer. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. The senior officer looked at Marcus, his face unreadable. "Looks like you just got yourself a lot more questions." Marcus swallowed hard. He didn't just have questions. He had a feeling that whatever was about to come next would change everything he thought he knew. Marcus stood frozen as the police car carrying Mr. Lawson disappeared down the street. His mind was spinning. What did he mean by "your father tried to stop it"? Stop what? And why had he been hiding all these years? Know what? Marcus asked, his patience wearing thin. The officer studied him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Then he sighed and glanced toward the hallway. "You might want to see this for yourself." Marcus hesitated, his stomach twisting into knots. Slowly, the officer helped him to his feet. His legs felt shaky beneath him as he was led toward the back room. He could feel the eyes of the other officers on him, watching his reaction. Then he saw it. And in that moment, his world would never be the same. Marcus stepped cautiously into the back room, his breath shallow, his pulse drumming in his ears. The officers stood around, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disbelief. In the center of the room, resting on the floor beneath the dim light, was the small box. It looked weathered, its edges worn from time, covered in a fine layer of dust, as if it had been untouched for years. One officer carefully lifted the lid, revealing a collection of old documents, faded photographs, and something that made Marcus's stomach twist, a small, rusted key. Marcus frowned, his mind racing. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The senior officer studied his face. "That's what we're trying to figure out. You really don't recognize any of this." Marcus shook his head. He had lived in this house most of his life, but he had never seen this box before. It didn't make sense. How could something so important, so secret, be hidden in his own home without him knowing? He stepped closer, peering at the contents. The documents were fragile, the paper yellowed with age. As he carefully picked up a photograph, a chill ran down his spine. It was a picture of his father, much younger, standing next to a man Marcus didn't recognize. Both were dressed formally, their expressions serious. There was something unsettling about the way they stood, as if they were guarding a secret. "What does this have to do with me?" Marcus asked, feeling an uneasy weight settle in his chest. The officer sighed. "We received a tip. Someone claimed there was something hidden in this house, something tied to a case that's been cold for decades." Marcus blinked. "A case?" The officer nodded. "We can't disclose everything yet, but let's just say, whatever's in this box might explain a lot." Marcus clenched his fists, frustration creeping in. His father had passed years ago, never speaking of anything like this. Could it be possible that his own family had been keeping secrets from him? He tried to push the thought away, but the evidence was right in front of him. Outside, the commotion hadn't died down. Neighbors whispered, speculated, recorded videos, turning Marcus's life into an unfolding spectacle. And then, as if the situation wasn't already overwhelming enough, another officer entered the room, holding a phone. His face was tense. "We have another problem," he announced. The senior officer turned to him. "What now?" "We traced the tip. The call came from inside the neighborhood." Marcus stiffened. Someone close by had set this in motion. Someone who knew what was in this house, maybe even before he did. The officer looked at Marcus carefully. "I think it's time you told us everything you know." Marcus swallowed hard. The problem was, he didn't know anything. But someone out there did, and they wanted him to pay the price for it. Marcus felt a cold chill creep down his spine. Someone in the neighborhood had tipped off the police. Someone had known about the box. But why now? Why after all these years? The senior officer's eyes locked onto Marcus, searching for any sign that he was hiding something. "We need the truth," he said firmly. Marcus's frustration boiled over. "I already told you, I don't know anything. This is my house. If there was some big secret hidden here, don't you think I would have found it by now?" The room fell silent for a moment. The officers exchanged glances, as if weighing his words. The tension was suffocating. Then the officer who had traced the tip spoke again, his voice lower this time. "The call was made an hour before we got here." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. An hour ago. That meant whoever called had been watching. Maybe they were still watching. His eyes flicked to the window. The crowd outside had grown, their faces illuminated by the glow of streetlights and flashing sirens. Somewhere in that sea of people, the caller could be standing, watching, waiting. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. His father's past. The hidden box. A mysterious informant who had chosen this exact night to reveal it all. It wasn't a coincidence. It started as an ordinary night in a quiet neighborhood. The streetlights flickered as a few late-night joggers passed by, unaware of the storm brewing just a few houses down. Then, without warning, flashing red and blue lights flooded the darkness, sirens cutting through the silence like a knife. Within seconds, police vehicles screeched to a halt in front of a modest home. Nothing extravagant, just a simple house with a neatly trimmed lawn and a porch light glowing softly. Officers poured out, moving with urgency, their radios crackling with coded messages. Neighbors peeked through their blinds, some stepping onto their porches, whispering amongst themselves. What was happening? Who lived there? The answer: a man named Marcus. A quiet, hard-working black man in his early 40s, known to most as the guy who always waved when passing by. He kept to himself, had a steady job, and never caused trouble. But tonight, his world was about to be turned upside down. Without knocking, the officers stormed the front door, shouting commands as they forced their way inside. Marcus, who had been sitting on his couch watching TV, barely had time to react before bright flashlights blinded his vision. His heart pounded in his chest. Confusion and fear twisted his thoughts. What was this? A mistake? A nightmare? "Get down, hands where we can see them," the officers barked. Marcus didn't resist, he couldn't. He had nothing to hide. He followed their orders, hands raised, palms open, his voice shaking as he tried to speak. "What's going on?" "You've got the wrong house." But his words were swallowed by the chaos. Drawers were yanked open, closets torn apart, furniture overturned. The officers were searching for something they believed was inside this house. But what? Drugs? Weapons? Some stolen item linked to a crime. Then in the back room, one officer called out, "Got something." The entire energy of the raid shifted. Radios buzzed, more officers rushed in. Marcus, still on the floor, tried to turn his head to see, but he couldn't. His mind raced. What did they find? Who put it there? And most importantly, how was this happening to him? And just like that, his quiet life, his safe home, and everything he thought he knew was shattered. But here's where things take an even more shocking turn. What the police uncovered was nothing they expected. And when the truth finally came out, it left everyone speechless. Stay with me, because this story is just getting started. Marcus could barely breathe as he lay on the cold floor, his hands still raised. His heart pounded so loudly that it drowned out the voices around him. His mind raced through every possible scenario. What could they have found? He had nothing illegal in his house, nothing that would warrant a raid like this. The officers muttered among themselves, their faces tense as they examined the item in question. One of them, a senior officer with graying hair, narrowed his eyes and held up a small, dust-covered box. It looked old, like something that had been hidden for a long time. He turned to another officer and whispered something before stepping back into the main room. Marcus tried to sit up, but an officer placed a firm hand on his shoulder, pushing him back down. "Stay where you are," he ordered. "This is insane," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "I don't know what's going on, but whatever you found, it's not mine." The officer didn't respond. Instead, he nodded toward the others, signaling them to continue their search. More drawers were pulled open, more belongings scattered across the floor. Meanwhile, outside, the neighborhood had fully awakened. More people stood on their porches, murmuring to one another. Some recorded the scene on their phones, their screens reflecting the flashing lights. Then a voice crackled through one of the police radios. "You're not gonna believe this. You need to see it for yourself." The senior officer hesitated for a moment before heading back to the other room. Marcus could hear the low hum of conversation, but couldn't make out the words. His frustration grew. "Can somebody please tell me what's happening?" he asked. Still, no answer. Memories flashed through his mind, his childhood in this very house, the years spent here with his family. His parents had lived in this home before him. After they passed, he held on to it, not just as a place to live, but as a piece of his past, something familiar in an ever-changing world. Nothing about his life was secretive or suspicious. So why were they treating him like a criminal? A few minutes later, the senior officer returned, his face unreadable. He knelt beside Marcus, looking him in the eye for the first time. "You really don't know, do you?" he asked, his voice softer than before. Stepping outside, Marcus took a deep breath. The crowd had started to thin out, but a few neighbors still lingered, whispering among themselves. He could feel their stares, their curiosity, their judgment. His life had changed in a matter of hours. His father wasn't the man he thought he was. His childhood home held secrets he never could have imagined. And somewhere out there, Mr. Lawson was either running again or being silenced for good. The flashing lights of the police cars reflected off the pavement as officers packed up their gear. One by one, they drove off into the night, leaving Marcus standing alone in front of his house. The place that had once felt safe now felt like a puzzle he might never solve. As he turned back toward the door, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.